Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The last thing I remember was the smell of burnt rubber, the sound of metal twisting like bone, and that eerie second of silence right before the world slammed into me like a damn freight train. I had taken the back road, just past the gas station with the rusted sign and the old man who always sold sour coffee for $2. It was raining, of course it was raining, like the universe wanted to make everything just a little bit more dramatic. One second I was singing along to some stupid 70s track on the radio, tapping the steering wheel like everything was fine, and the next, I was upside down, bleeding and begging my own lungs to keep working. That was the last conscious thought I had before everything faded into black, thick and endless like drowning in oil. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. 2 whole days, and nobody had bothered to show up. The ceiling above me was that sterile white every hospital seems to love, and the smell of antiseptic clawed into my nose like claws. My mouth was dry, lips cracked, and my head felt like someone had cracked it open with a brick and glued it back together with regret. But I was alive. Barely. Alive and utterly alone. The nurse came in not long after I woke, young woman, maybe in her 20s, with a face too chipper for someone working in a trauma ward. She smiled like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't covered in bruises and stitched up like Frankenstein's forgotten cousin. "Oh good, you're awake," she said, like I'd just taken a nap. "Your parents called yesterday. They said not to worry. They're in Italy, enjoying Rome. They flew out the day after your accident." I stared at her like she'd just recited a joke in Latin. I thought I heard her wrong. Italy? Rome? They left? The nurse said it so casually, like she was giving me the weather report, not telling me my own blood and bone had skipped the country while I was hooked to a damn breathing tube. I tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough, sharp and hollow. My ribs screamed in protest. The nurse handed me my phone and left the room, probably thinking I was about to text a sweet little thank you message to my globe-trotting, heartless parents. I opened my messages, hands shaking more from rage than pain. My mother's last text read, "Flight landed safe. Weather's perfect here. Don't bother us in Rome unless it's life or death." The timestamp was from the morning after the crash. Not even a "how are you?" Not a call from my father, not a single message from my sister. Just a smiling selfie from my mother in front of the damn Colosseum. That's when the memories started seeping in, not just from the accident, but from years before it. All the birthdays they forgot, the school plays they never showed up for, the times they made me sit through Lily's piano recitals like it was the second coming of Mozart, while I couldn't even get them to remember my college major. Lily was always the delicate one. The golden child. The sun they orbited around. And I was just extra weight. A sturdy backup. A reliable disappointment. I remember once, when I broke my ankle in high school, my mom told me, "Well, you're tougher than Lily. You'll manage." That was her version of comfort. My father barely said a word, except to ask if I'd still be able to drive myself to school. So no, their absence wasn't exactly new. It was just louder this time. Harder to ignore when you've got a catheter in one arm and stitches in your face. I laid there in that hospital bed, heart pounding with something colder than anger. It was clarity. Pure, sharp, unfiltered clarity. They'd left me for dead and jetted off to sip overpriced wine and post filtered selfies like everything was just peachy. And I was supposed to just lie here and recover while they played tourists in some postcard perfect fantasy? Nah, not this time. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone across the room or call them sobbing for answers. I just stared at the screen for a minute, then unlocked my banking app with my thumbprint. Because if they wanted distance, if they really thought I was just going to disappear into the background again like I always had, well, I was ready to give them exactly what they asked for. But not before making sure they'd feel it. Every single inch. I didn't rush it, not at first, because something about the slow unraveling of control felt sweeter than a sudden punch. While my body healed in that stiff hospital bed, with bruises blooming like dark flowers across my skin, I began plotting the smallest rebellion that would become something far bigger than I expected. I wasn't screaming or breaking things. I was studying, thinking, planning in silence, like a surgeon holding a scalpel just beneath the skin, waiting for the precise incision. I opened the banking app and just sat with it for a moment, watching the little numbers light up on the screen, digits that had always been just out of my reach unless I asked permission like a child asking for candy. It was a joint account, technically one I was still tied to from years ago when my father insisted we keep everything family-centered for security. So I started small, barely enough to be noticed. A few test transfers, $20 here, 35 there, nothing that would ring alarm bells. I watched like a hawk, waiting for notifications, seeing if any automatic alerts went off, but the system was quiet. The money moved smoothly into my personal account, the one no one else knew about, like a whisper under a locked door. I didn't touch anything big yet, because revenge, if it's going to be done right, shouldn't be a scream. It should be a whisper that builds until it becomes a roar. By the third day, I'd memorized the flow of the family's spending. Flights, hotels, expensive dinners, boutique shops, all neatly logged and time-stamped like a diary of indulgence. I pictured them in some overpriced Roman restaurant, my father swirling wine he couldn't pronounce while my mother posed for a picture she'd caption, "Living our best lives," with some tired quote from a travel blog. My sister would probably be glued to her phone, uploading stories to Instagram, captioning everything with hashtags that made her sound enlightened. Hashtag soul journey, hashtag row magic, hashtag family first. Family first. That one burned the most. So I hit the freeze button on the primary card. Just a single tap, and everything under their financial umbrella locked up tighter than a vault. No alerts, no warnings, just cold, digital silence. I didn't smile when I did it, but my jaw unclenched for the first time in days. Then I hit freeze on the second card, then the third. By the time I was done, every access point they had to our joint accounts was locked down, secured under my control, and backed by a new PIN code they didn't even know existed. "Let's see how well that pasta tastes when your visa gets declined," I muttered, tossing my phone gently onto the blanket beside me, feeling more awake than I had in months. Maybe years. And right on cue, the chaos began to bloom like wildfire on a dry field. I didn't even have time to finish my lukewarm hospital lunch before my phone lit up with messages. First it was my mom. Typical frantic tone. No empathy, just fury. "What's happening with the account? Our cards aren't working. Are you touching things you shouldn't? No, how are you feeling? Are you okay? Are you eating? Are you even alive?" Just panic over a frozen credit card. That told me everything I needed to know. Then came the second message, a longer one, dripping with the same polished guilt she always used when she wanted to get her way. "Sweetheart, we're in a foreign country. This isn't funny. Please don't play these games while we're trying to enjoy our trip. We've earned this." They'd earned it. That's what she said. Like I'd somehow disrupted their divine right to escape and pretend their family wasn't rotting under the surface. And maybe you're wondering now, was it petty? Was it cruel? Was it unnecessary? Maybe. Maybe I should have just let it go, healed quietly, nodded politely when they returned, and let their betrayal become just another story buried in the mess of family dysfunction. But let me ask you something, ever been left behind by the people who were supposed to protect you? Ever sat alone in a hospital room, body broken, mind unraveling, and realized no one was coming through that door for you? What would you have done in my place? Be honest? Would you just sit and cry, or would you burn the damn bridge too? Because I didn't just burn it. I salted the earth underneath. The messages kept coming. My dad chimed in next, blunt and useless. "Fix this now. This isn't a joke. You're hurting everyone." As if I'd stolen their oxygen instead of simply taking back control of my own damn life. And still, not a single question about my health, not a single acknowledgement that I was even alive after a life-threatening crash. It was like I was just a technical glitch in their vacation plans. But the part that really sent me over the edge wasn't the texts or the accusations, it was the next notification. Another photo, this time from a gondola ride in Venice, with my mother smiling like she hadn't just abandoned her daughter in a hospital bed a few days ago. The caption? "Unforgettable moments with family." That word again. Family. They tossed it around like confetti while burying me alive under their indifference. And just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, my phone rang. It was Lily, my sister, the golden child, the flawless one, the one who could burn the house down and still be called graceful. I stared at the screen for a moment, half tempted to let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her voice, to hear how far the rot had spread. I answered. She didn't even say hello. Her voice came sharp, clipped, irritated. What the hell did you do? Mom's freaking out. Dad's threatening to call the bank. Fix this now. Not even are you okay? Not even I'm sorry we weren't there. Nothing. Just demands. Just control. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. This was war. I wish I could say Lily's phone call surprised me, that I was caught off guard by the sharpness in her voice or the sheer entitlement woven into every syllable she spit at me, but that would be a lie too big to swallow. It was textbook Lily, demand first, justify later, and never ask, not really. Never ask about the parts that matter. She didn't care if I was broken, stitched up, limping through a hallway with gauze wrapped around my ribs and painkillers dulling everything except the dull pulse of betrayal running underneath my skin. No, her only concern was what I'd done and how quickly I could undo it, as if I were just a rogue button to be reset. But what she didn't understand, what none of them ever really understood, was that this wasn't a glitch. This was a goddamn reckoning. And it didn't start with the crash, it started long before that. It started in childhood, in the quiet corners of the house where love was measured in gifts and attention and soft voices reserved for Lily, always Lily, only Lily. She was the fragile one, the delicate flower, the precious little gem that had to be cradled and protected and lavished with affection, while I was told I was strong enough to manage on my own. I remember being 9 and watching her unwrap her 3rd birthday gift while I stood on the sidelines with a plastic party hat slipping off my head, holding a slice of cake that tasted like drywall and realizing, even then, I wasn't part of the celebration. I was part of the furniture. Lily is delicate. You're just strong. You'll be fine. That phrase got passed around so often it might as well have been stitched onto the living room throw pillows. Every time I scraped my knee or had a stomach ache or needed a parent to sit beside me during a doctor's appointment, I was met with that same shrugging dismissal. You'll be fine. No hand on my shoulder, no lingering hug, just a pat on the back and a reminder that my pain didn't warrant concern. And it didn't stop with childhood. It carried right into high school, where my science fair ribbons barely earned a glance while Lily's mediocre piano recitals were treated like Carnegie Hall performances. I remember walking across the stage at graduation, scanning the crowd for their faces, only to realize they'd shown up late and left early, barely clapping when my name was called. That night, I overheard my mother telling someone on the phone, "We're just focused on Lily's college prep right now. She's under a lot of pressure." As if my milestone was just background noise to the main event that was my sister's existence. And yes, I carried that resentment. I carried it in my bones, in my clenched jaw, in the way I learned to keep my voice low and my needs smaller than hers so I wouldn't be accused of causing trouble. I carried it for years until it hardened into something unmovable, something even I couldn't soften anymore. So when I checked myself out of that hospital, it wasn't out of impulse or bitterness, it was a decision made with the same clarity that led me to freeze those accounts. I didn't even tell the nurse I was leaving. I just got up, changed into the clothes I'd asked them to bring from my wrecked car, and limped out without a goodbye. The hospital bill would come eventually, and I'd deal with that when I had to. But right then, I needed distance more than I needed recovery. I paid cash for a dingy motel room just off a side road near the edge of town, a place where the wallpaper was peeling, the carpet smelled like wet socks, and the bed creaked if you even looked at it wrong. But it was quiet. It was private. It was mine. I shut the door, tossed my bag on the floor, and finally exhaled without feeling watched. My phone was still buzzing, of course. Calls, texts, voicemails, all of them flooding in like a broken dam. First my mother, then my father, then Lily again, her tone shifting from anger to fake concern to full-blown manipulation. "You need help," she said in one message, like I was a broken toy instead of a woman standing on the edge of liberation. You're spiraling, and this isn't healthy. Funny how the people who ignore your pain for years suddenly become therapists when their money's on the line. I didn't reply. I let every notification pile up like junk mail, swiping them away without opening them. I wasn't interested in their apologies, especially when I knew they were just trying to claw their way back into control. I wasn't interested in their explanations or their excuses or whatever carefully worded lie they'd cooked up to justify leaving me behind. Because now, for the first time in my life, they needed me more than I needed them. I sat on the edge of that motel bed, staring at the flickering light above me, wondering how long it would take before the panic turned to desperation. I didn't have to wait long. My phone vibrated again, this time not from a message but a notification from the bank itself. Emergency wire transfer failed. Funds frozen. And that's when I smiled, really smiled, for the first time since the crash. It took him longer than I expected, honestly. My father had always been the quieter manipulator of the two, the man who wore silence like a suit and used passive disappointment as his weapon of choice. He didn't shout or scream or throw plates across the kitchen like you see in movies. He just withdrew, turned cold, delivered his judgments in half sentences and heavy sighs that made you feel like you'd failed some test you never knew you were taking. So when his first message finally came through, I stared at the screen for a while, not quite surprised by the words, but still feeling that familiar, sinking weight in my chest that came with every exchange we'd ever had. This isn't funny. You're hurting the whole family. That was it. No greeting, no question, no goddamn acknowledgement of what they had done to me. Just a statement drenched in guilt and superiority, like I was a child throwing a tantrum in the middle of a grocery store, embarrassing them in front of strangers. I read it 3 times, trying to decide if it was worth replying at all. But I wasn't that little girl anymore, sitting quietly while Lily got all the attention. I had no reason to stay silent now, not with everything I'd been through and everything they'd taken. So I wrote back, my fingers steady and my pulse low, no anger in my words, just clarity, sharp and deliberate. You mean like leaving me to rot in a hospital bed while you were drinking Chianti in Rome? I hit send and didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. The silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. That was the moment I realized I held every string now. They were tangled in their own mess, panicking behind the scenes, scrambling to regain access to accounts they'd once used like lifelines. And I knew then, without a shred of doubt, that I could bend this situation into something bigger than revenge. I could finally get what had always been withheld from me, not just respect or attention, but the truth I'd always suspected was there, lurking beneath the surface of our picture-perfect family facade. So I sent another message, this one colder, sharper, more surgical in its intent. You want your accounts back? Fine. I want something too. I want what's mine. I want answers. I knew it would strike a nerve, because people like my parents didn't operate on honesty. They thrived on omission, on pretending everything was balanced while hiding the real numbers behind the curtain. And if there was anything I'd learned growing up in that house, it was that money wasn't just currency. It was power, silence, control, and favoritism wrapped in a bank statement. At first, they ignored me, hoping I'd fold. But I didn't. I waited. I let the discomfort stretch, let their nerves fray, let their transactions continue to fail. And when I knew they were at their most desperate, I pressed harder. I know something was set aside for me. I want to see the paperwork. Don't pretend there wasn't. I remember the meetings, the phone calls, the way you used to hush me when I came into the room. And that's when the cracks started showing. My mother tried first, calling me 3 times in a row, leaving voicemails with the same pathetic tone she used when she needed something, fake concern laced with barely concealed frustration. We never kept anything from you. You're being paranoid. Just give us the login access and we'll talk properly. But I didn't budge, not even an inch. I'd spent my whole life giving in, apologizing for feeling forgotten, for wanting something as simple as equal footing in my own damn family. Not anymore. Then came the message from my father, the one that changed everything. There was a fund. It was set up years ago, but things changed. We needed it for Lily's education. It was better used that way. I read that line 5 times, each word digging into me like a splinter beneath the skin. So it was true. There was a trust. Something meant for me, something promised to me in the vague way they used to speak about the future when I was younger and still naive enough to believe their intentions were pure. And they didn't just forget about it or repurpose it out of necessity. They funneled it directly into Lily's law school, without so much as a conversation, without asking if I'd be okay, without even a second thought. That wasn't just abandonment. That was theft. They didn't just leave me behind in that hospital. They robbed me blind while calling it doing what's best for the family. And maybe you think money doesn't matter, that it's not worth the emotional fallout or the revenge. But it wasn't about the dollar amount, it was about the principle, the quiet declaration they'd made long ago, that I was expendable and Lily was the investment. I didn't reply to either of them after that. I just sat there, back against the headboard in that cheap motel room, heart pounding with a strange mix of fury and freedom. Because now I knew the truth. I wasn't imagining the favoritism. I wasn't exaggerating the injustice. I had proof, cold, undeniable proof. But I needed more than proof. I needed closure. I needed someone who could confirm what I already suspected but hadn't yet fully pieced together. So I made a call of my own, this time to an old family contact I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Mr. Crenshaw. The family's lawyer from when I was a teenager, a man who had always seemed too honest to be in their orbit for long. He agreed to meet me at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where secrets could be spoken over burnt coffee and no one asked questions. He arrived wearing this same tweed jacket I remembered, his hair thinner, but his eyes still sharp as ever. He sat across from me, looked at my face, and before I even said a word, he leaned in and sighed, low and heavy like a man who'd been carrying something too long. "You weren't supposed to find out," he said. There's something unnervingly calm about revenge when it's handled right, when it's done without shouting or flailing or slamming doors in a dramatic storm of rage. I didn't need fire and fury anymore. I didn't need their attention or their guilt or their excuses. I needed control, precise, surgical, airtight control, and for the first time in my life, I finally had it. No more begging to be seen. No more shrinking myself down to make room for Lily's spotlight. No more asking permission just to breathe in a house that had always made me feel like an intruder. I didn't announce anything, didn't warn them, didn't gloat. I simply filed the paperwork. A civil suit, meticulously prepared with Crenshaw's help, pulled straight from the cold facts of what they'd done. He was hesitant at first, probably still stuck in some outdated loyalty to the family name, but once I showed him the account records and the documentation of the trust, he leaned back in his chair and muttered, "This isn't just unethical, it's illegal." That was all I needed to hear. From that moment on, I treated it like a business transaction, emotionless, deliberate, and calculated down to the last decimal. I didn't show up to the hearings in person. I didn't need the dramatic courtroom showdown or some emotional confrontation where everyone cried and hugged and promised to do better. I wasn't interested in redemption arcs or apologies wrapped in crocodile tears. I watched it all unfold from a distance, reading updates through my lawyer's brief emails and legal notices, each one colder than the last. It was a process designed to dismantle, to strip away the illusion of family unity they had so carefully curated for decades. And it worked. Slowly, their grip started slipping. The accounts remained locked. The assets they thought were untouchable began to shift under their feet. Lily's tuition reimbursements got flagged for review. My parents' travel expenses were pulled into scrutiny. Their pristine little image started to crack, and I could almost hear the sound of their panic echoing through the hollow spaces they used to fill with arrogance. They tried to salvage it, of course, calling in favors, whispering to friends about a misunderstanding and a family dispute taken too far. But money talks louder than stories, and mine came backed with paperwork. I saw the first article online just 2 weeks after the case went public. It was buried under a local finance section headline, something sterile and clinical like, "Misappropriated Family Trust Under Investigation." But I recognized the language. I recognized the names. And I recognized the fear underneath every statement my father's lawyer gave to the press. The damage wasn't just financial, It was reputational, and they knew it. They'd spent years crafting this perfect image of the successful, polished American family, educated children, stable careers, philanthropic donations, holiday cards that looked like magazine ads. Now it was unraveling thread by thread. And still, I stayed quiet. I didn't do interviews. I didn't make social media posts. I didn't even respond to the messages still pouring into my inbox like desperate raindrops on a leaking roof. Because this wasn't about theatrics, it was about balance, about reclaiming something that had been stolen from me in silence and returning the favor in kind. Lily was the first to crack. She called again, voice shaking, not with guilt but with fear. "You're ruining everything," she said, barely holding herself together. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family?" I didn't hesitate. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not ruining anything. I'm fixing it." That was the truth of it. I wasn't burning bridges. I was rebuilding a road they never let me walk on. I was carving out space for my own voice in a house that had only ever echoed with theirs. I was finally choosing myself, not out of spite or bitterness, but because it was the only thing left that made sense. And when the final ruling came through, I withdrew every last cent from the joint accounts. Every savings deposit, every retirement fund they'd used my name to leverage, every dollar that had been funneled away under the guise of family planning. I moved it all. Every bit of it. And then, just for the poetic satisfaction of it, I left exactly $1 in each account. Not out of pettiness, but because I wanted them to feel the emptiness in a way numbers alone couldn't explain. No screaming, no chaos, no confrontation, just cold, deliberate justice served through clean bank statements and silent withdrawals. The kind of justice that stings deeper because it leaves nothing to argue with. And then, one evening, just after sunset, there was a knock at my motel room door. I hadn't told anyone where I was, hadn't given a trace of my location beyond the lawyer's office. But somehow, she found me. I opened the door slowly, expecting maybe another delivery or some confused stranger looking for the wrong room. But it was her. My mother. She stood there on the threshold, tear-streaked, makeup smeared, hair a mess, shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before, not even during funerals or financial crises or any of the rare moments life had actually pushed back at her. She looked human for once. Fragile. Tired. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one waiting for her approval. She didn't speak right away. Her lips parted, but the words stuck somewhere between her throat and her pride. She looked at me like she'd never really seen me before, like I'd grown into someone unfamiliar, someone dangerous, someone finally capable of pushing back. But I didn't invite her in. Not yet. She stood on the doorstep like a ghost from a past life, not the polished, composed woman I had grown up watching float through rooms like royalty, but a figure collapsed into something smaller, older, worn down by reality in a way I never thought I'd witness. There was something hollow in her eyes, something desperate, maybe even frightened, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, electric, almost unbearable, and I could hear the motel's neon sign buzzing faintly behind me, a constant reminder that this was no place for dramatic family reunions or soft, healing resolutions. Then finally, she spoke, voice cracking in places she would have once masked behind a forced laugh or a patronizing smile. "We were scared," she said, and the words came out in a quiet, broken tone that felt like it had taken days to form. "We didn't know how to handle it. We didn't know what to do." And I stared at her like she'd just tried to rewrite history with one trembling sentence. My fists clenched at my sides, not from anger anymore, but from restraint, from the need to not scream, not shake her by the shoulders and demand to know when that fear had ever translated into abandonment. I wanted to believe she meant it. I wanted to believe, even for a second, that this wasn't just another manipulation wrapped in a softer voice, another attempt to rewrite the narrative now that they'd lost control of it. "Bullshit," I said, and my voice didn't even rise, it landed flat and cold, the kind of cold you only earn after years of being dismissed, after wounds have turned into scars so thick they feel like armor. "You weren't scared. You were selfish. You didn't want to be bothered. You wanted Italy. You wanted Rome. You wanted wine and photo ops and to pretend I wasn't lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm while your plane took off without a second thought. She flinched at that, the truth hitting her harder than I think she expected, and for a moment, I saw the woman she really was, barefaced, stripped of control, standing in front of the daughter she had never truly known. But still, she didn't leave. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled something out, slowly, like it mattered, like it was sacred somehow. A photo. It was old, worn at the edges, printed on that slightly faded paper from before everything went digital. She held it out to me like it was a peace offering, something delicate enough to fix the years between us. I took it without thinking, more out of reflex than interest, and when I looked down, I had to blink twice to make sense of it. It was me. Me as a baby, chubby, grinning, wrapped in a yellow blanket I vaguely remembered from some half-buried memory. My mother was in the photo too, younger, softer, hair tied back in a way I'd never seen before, her eyes focused not on the camera, but on me. And there was something in that look, something real, tenderness, maybe, or affection that I hadn't thought she was capable of anymore. I found it behind Lily's old trophies, she said, and there was something strangely apologetic in her voice, like even she understood the weight of what that sentence meant. I thought you should have it. And for a second, just a flicker, I felt that old, stupid hope trying to claw its way back into me, that little voice whispering that maybe it hadn't all been fake, that maybe she had loved me, just not in the way I needed, not in the way that mattered when it counted most. But then another voice, louder and more certain, reminded me that love buried beneath trophies and silence and abandonment isn't really love at all. It's a story we tell ourselves to soften the truth. I didn't say thank you. I didn't cry or hug her or ask her to stay. I just turned, walked back inside, and left the photo on the small table by the door. Let it sit there like a question mark, one more thing she couldn't answer, one more echo of what could have been if any of them had chosen differently. That was the last time I saw her. I didn't return to the motel after that. I packed my things, emptied the room, and disappeared the way they always seemed to wish I would. I found a small cabin in a quiet town no one's ever heard of, no streetlights, no neighbors close enough to hear your thoughts, just trees and wind and silence that feels more like comfort than isolation. There's peace in being unreachable, in knowing that no one can pull you back into a life that never made space for you in the first place. I still get the occasional email from Lily, always short, always too late, little attempts at reconciliation that feel more like guilt management than actual connection. I never reply. I don't need to. The silence says more than I ever could. Sometimes I look at that photo, the one my mother left behind. I didn't throw it away. I didn't frame it either. I just keep it tucked in the back of a drawer, not because it means something sentimental, but because it reminds me that even things that look like love can be misplaced, forgotten, buried under someone else's spotlight. They still don't know where I live. And I'm okay with that.